What happens when Brendan Fraser sits across from Whoopi Goldberg on The View, and a simple conversation suddenly turns uncomfortable on live television? Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. Alright, so the segment starts off pretty normal. The audience is clapping, there's that usual daytime energy, and Whoopi is leading the panel like she always does, calm, in control, just setting the tone. Whoopi leans slightly forward, looking at Brendan with a polite smile. So Brendan, first of all, it's really good to have you here. People have been talking a lot about your comeback, your journey. How are you feeling about everything right now? Brendan nods, smiles a bit. You can tell he's appreciative, but also a little reserved. Thank you, it's been a lot. I mean, I'm grateful, honestly. I didn't expect this kind of response, but it's been really humbling. Audience claps lightly. One of the co-hosts chimes in, something supportive, and everything still feels very smooth. Whoopi nods again, then slightly shifts her posture, like she's about to go deeper. You've been very open recently about your struggles in the industry, and also about how Hollywood treated you at certain points. Do you feel like things have really changed? There's a small pause. Brendan looks down for just a second before answering. I think some things have changed, but I also think people only start listening when it becomes a story they can't ignore anymore. The audience gets quieter. That line lands. Whoopi tilts her head a little. What do you mean by that? Brendan exhales slightly, not defensive, but more thoughtful. I mean, there are a lot of people who go through difficult situations, not just in this industry, and, for a long time, nobody really pays attention. And then suddenly, when it becomes public, it's like, now it matters. One of the co-hosts nods slowly. You can feel the tone shifting from light to serious. Whoopi responds, a bit more direct now. But isn't that how it works, though? I mean, people can't react to what they don't know. Brendan looks at her. And this is where the energy changes just a bit. Sure, but sometimes people do know. They just choose not to say anything. There's a small murmur from the audience. Not loud, but noticeable. Whoopi raises her eyebrows slightly. That's a strong statement. Brendan shrugs lightly. I'm just speaking from my experience. There's a brief pause. One of the co-hosts tries to ease the tension. Well, I think what Brendan is saying is that sometimes systems protect themselves, right? Whoopi glances toward her, then back at Brendan. Or, sometimes people interpret situations differently. Now you can feel it. It's subtle, but there's a shift. Brendan notices it too. He leans forward just a little. I understand that. But I also think, when multiple people come forward over time, maybe it's worth taking a closer look instead of brushing it off. The audience reacts again, this time a mix of quiet claps and murmurs. Whoopi folds her hands together. No one's brushing anything off. But we also have to be careful about how we frame things. Accusations are serious. Brendan nods slowly. I agree. They're serious. That's exactly why they shouldn't be ignored. There's a brief silence. You can tell this wasn't where Whoopi expected the conversation to go. One of the co-hosts tries to jump in again. I think both of you are kind of saying the same thing, just from different angles. But Whoopi gently cuts in. No, not exactly. That gets the audience's attention immediately. She turns back to Brendan. What I'm saying is, there's a responsibility when you speak publicly about these things. Because it shapes how people see others, sometimes without the full picture. Brendan's expression tightens slightly, not angry, but more firm now. And what I'm saying is, there's also a responsibility to listen when someone speaks up, even if it's uncomfortable. That line hits harder. The audience reacts more noticeably this time. Some claps, some sounds. Whoopi leans back slightly in her chair. And people did listen. You're here, you're being heard. Brendan nods, but doesn't fully agree. I'm being heard now. That wasn't always the case. There's a pause again. You can feel the tension building, but it's still controlled. It's not shouting. It's that quiet, serious disagreement that feels more real. One of the co-hosts smiles nervously, trying to lighten things just a bit. Well, this is definitely a conversation a lot of people are having right now. Brendan gives a small smile, but he stays focused. Yeah, and I think it's an important one. Whoopi looks at him for a moment, then nods slightly, but her expression is more measured now. No one's saying it isn't important. Another pause. The audience is completely engaged now. You can feel it in the room, no distractions, everyone watching closely. And just as it seems like the moment might settle down, Whoopi adds one more thing calmly, but with a sharper edge. I just think, sometimes these conversations need more balance than emotion. That's the line that shifts everything. Brendan looks at her, this time holding eye contact a little longer. And you can tell, this conversation is far from over. Brendan doesn't answer right away. There's a noticeable pause, the kind that makes the audience lean in without even realizing it. He shifts slightly in his seat, then looks back at Whoopi Goldberg, calm but clearly more focused now. I don't think emotion and balance are opposites, he says, his voice steady. Sometimes emotion is what forces people to finally look at something they've been ignoring. A few people in the audience clap, hesitant at first, then a little stronger. Whoopi tilts her head, listening, but her expression doesn't soften much. But emotion can also cloud judgment, she replies. And when you're talking about real people, real reputations, that matters. Brendan nods, like he expected that response. It does matter, he agrees. But so does silence. And I think silence has done more damage than emotion ever could. That lands heavier than anything before it. The audience reacts again, this time more split. Some clapping, some just quiet. One of the co-hosts leans in quickly, trying to smooth things over. I think what Brendan's pointing to is that there's been a long history of people not feeling safe to speak up. Whoopi raises her hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to pause the interruption. And I hear that, she says. I really do. But I've also been around long enough to see situations where things weren't what they seemed at first. She turns back to Brendan. So my question to you is, how do we make sure we're being fair to everyone involved? There's a shift in Brendan's posture now. He leans forward a little more, elbows closer to his knees, fully engaged. I think fairness starts with actually listening, he says. Not waiting for the perfect version of a story. Not expecting someone to have everything figured out before they're allowed to speak. Whoopi responds quickly this time. But listening doesn't mean agreeing. Brendan nods immediately. I'm not asking for agreement. I'm asking for acknowledgement. That word, acknowledgement, hangs in the air for a second. The audience reacts again, softer this time, like they're processing rather than reacting. One of the other co-hosts looks between them, clearly aware of the tension. This is actually a really important distinction, she says. Because I think a lot of people confuse those two things, listening versus agreeing. Whoopi glances at her, then back at Brendan. All right, but let me ask you this, she continues. When you talk about your experience publicly, do you think about how it affects the people you're talking about? Even indirectly? Brendan takes a breath before answering. Of course I do, he says. I think about it a lot. But I also think about the people who might be going through something similar and feel like they can't say anything. He pauses briefly, then adds, and if me speaking helps even one person feel less alone, then I think that matters too. That gets a stronger reaction from the audience, applause, more unified this time. Whoopi watches him closely, her expression still composed but clearly more serious. No one's saying it doesn't matter, she says. But there's a line, and sometimes that line gets blurred in public conversations. Brendan's tone stays calm, but there's more conviction now. I think that line has been used as a reason to stay quiet for a long time. A few audible sounds come from the audience. Whoopi leans back slightly, crossing her arms loosely, not defensive but firm. Or, it's been used to protect people from being unfairly judged. There's that divide again. One co-host tries to step in with a lighter tone. This is definitely one of those conversations where there's no easy answer. But Brendan speaks before she can finish. I'm not saying there's an easy answer, he says. I'm just saying, doing nothing hasn't worked. That line hits. The audience reacts again, some clapping, some just watching closely. Whoopi exhales slightly, not frustrated, but clearly engaged now in a way that's deeper than the usual talk show rhythm. Doing nothing isn't what's happening, she says. There are systems in place now. There are conversations happening. People are more aware than they used to be. Brendan nods, acknowledging that. That's true, he says. And that's a good thing. But those systems didn't just appear out of nowhere. They came from people speaking up, even when it was uncomfortable, even when they were told to stay quiet. The audience claps again, louder this time. Whoopi doesn't interrupt immediately. She lets the applause settle, then responds. And sometimes, she says carefully, those conversations can go too far. That's the part people don't always want to talk about. Brendan tilts his head slightly. What do you mean by too far? Whoopi looks directly at him. I mean, when people are judged in the court of public opinion without all the facts. When narratives take over before the truth is fully understood. There's a small shift in the audience. Less applause, more quiet attention. Brendan nods slowly. I understand that concern, he says. I really do. But I think the bigger issue has been people not being believed at all. One of the co-hosts softly adds. That's been a huge part of the conversation in recent years. Whoopi glances at her briefly, then back to Brendan. And now we're trying to find the balance, she says. That's all I'm saying. Brendan leans back slightly now, but his focus doesn't break. Balance is important, he agrees. But balance shouldn't come at the cost of someone's voice. That line draws another strong reaction, applause, louder than before. You can feel the room shifting more toward Brendan now, at least emotionally. Whoopi notices it too, but she doesn't change her tone. No one is taking away anyone's voice, she says. We're just asking for responsibility along with it. Brendan responds almost immediately. And I think responsibility includes listening, even when it's uncomfortable. There's a brief silence after that, the kind where neither side speaks for a second longer than usual. One of the co-hosts looks toward the audience, then back at both of them. This is real, she says quietly. This is what people are talking about at home every day. A few audience members nod visibly. Whoopi finally breaks the pause. And it's good to talk about it, she says. I just don't want it to turn into something where people feel like they can't question anything. Brendan's expression softens slightly, but his point doesn't change. Questioning is important, he says. But so is believing that someone's experience is valid, even if you don't have all the answers yet. That line brings another wave of applause. And now, the energy in the room is noticeably different from the beginning. What started as a standard interview has turned into something much more layered, more personal, more tense. Whoopi nods slowly, as if weighing everything that's been said. All right, she says. Let's take a breath for a second. There's a small ripple of laughter from the audience, light but needed. One of the co-hosts smiles. Yes, let's all take a breath. But even as they try to reset the mood, you can tell, it hasn't really settled. Because just before the conversation shifts, Whoopi adds one more line, quieter this time, but pointed. I just hope people understand, there are always multiple sides to every story. Brendan looks at her again. And this time, his response comes without hesitation. And I hope people understand, sometimes one side hasn't been heard at all. The audience reacts immediately, loud applause now. And just like that, the tension isn't just there anymore. It's fully out in the open. The applause lingers a little longer this time, and you can feel that the room has picked a side emotionally, even if no one's saying it outright. Whoopi Goldberg sits still for a moment, letting the reaction pass, her expression thoughtful but firm. Brendan Fraser doesn't look away either. There's no hostility in his face, but there's a quiet determination now that wasn't there at the start. One of the co-hosts leans forward quickly, sensing the moment needs steering. You know what? This is actually one of the most honest conversations we've had in a while, she says, half smiling, trying to ease the tension just a bit. And I think people at home are probably really relating to both of you right now. A few audience members clap lightly, almost in agreement with the attempt to balance things out. Whoopi nods slightly but doesn't jump in right away. Instead, she turns back to Brendan, her tone a little softer, but still direct. Let me ask you something personal, she says. When you look back at everything you went through, do you feel like the industry owes you something now? That question shifts the energy again, not as sharp as before, but more personal. Brendan exhales, a faint smile appearing for a second, almost like he didn't expect that angle. No, he says. I don't think anyone owes me anything. There's a slight pause, and then he continues. But I do think there's a responsibility moving forward. Not just for me, for everyone. To make sure people don't feel invisible the way I did. The audience responds with a steady round of applause. It's not explosive, but it's sincere. Whoopi listens carefully, then nods. Okay, she says. That's fair. But then she adds, just slightly shifting her tone again. But you understand why some people might feel like these conversations are happening in a way that puts a spotlight on the past without always offering clarity. Brendan tilts his head slightly. I think clarity takes time, he replies. And sometimes people want clarity before they're willing to even acknowledge that something happened. One of the co-hosts quietly says, That's true, almost under her breath, but the mic picks it up, and the audience reacts with a few soft laughs. Whoopi glances at her briefly, then back at Brendan. And sometimes people want acknowledgement before all the facts are there, she counters. There's that back and forth again, calm, but firm. Brendan nods. Because for a lot of people, acknowledgement is the first step toward healing, he says. It's not the final step, it's just the beginning. The audience claps again, louder this time. Whoopi leans forward slightly, resting her hands together. I don't disagree with that, she says. I just think there has to be room for questions too. Brendan doesn't hesitate. There should be, he agrees. But questions shouldn't come across as doubt right away. That's where people start to shut down. There's a noticeable shift in the audience. More nodding now, more quiet agreement. One of the co-hosts jumps in, trying to bridge the gap again. I think what Brendan is saying is that tone matters. Like, how we ask those questions matters. Whoopi gives a small nod. Tone always matters, she says. But intent matters too. Brendan leans back slightly, considering that. I agree, he says. But intent isn't always what people feel. And sometimes what people feel is what stays with them. There's a pause. That line sits in the air longer than most. The audience doesn't react immediately this time. They just listen. Whoopi looks at him closely, almost studying his words. So what would you want people to do differently? She asks. If you could change one thing about how these conversations happen, what would it be? Brendan takes a moment before answering. You can tell he's choosing his words carefully. I think I'd want people to lead with empathy first, he says. Before analysis. Before skepticism. Just listen with the intention of understanding, not immediately evaluating. The audience responds again, this time with one of the strongest rounds of applause so far. Whoopi nods slowly, absorbing that. And after empathy, she asks. Then comes everything else, Brendan replies. The questions, the context, the facts. But if you skip that first step, the rest of it doesn't land the same way. One of the co-hosts smiles. That actually makes a lot of sense, she says. Another co-host adds, yeah, because people can tell when they're being heard versus when they're being assessed. There's a small ripple of laughter from the audience. Whoopi allows herself a slight smile at that, but she's still focused. I hear you, she says. I do. And I think a lot of people will hear you too. Then she pauses, just for a second longer than usual. But I also think there's a fear, whether people admit it or not, that things can swing too far in the other direction. Brendan's expression tightens slightly again, not in frustration, but in concentration. What does too far look like to you? He asks. Whoopi answers without hesitation. It looks like a space where people feel like they can't question anything without being judged themselves, she says. Where conversation turns into sides instead of understanding. The audience quiets down again. Brendan nods slowly. I understand that concern, he says. I really do. But I think we're still a long way from that being the bigger problem. That line draws a mixed reaction. Some applause, some silence. Whoopi notices it. See, that's where people might disagree, she says. Because for some, it already feels like that. Brendan leans forward again, his tone still calm but more intent now. And for others, he says, it still feels like they're not being heard at all. There's that divide again, clear, undeniable. One of the co-hosts lets out a small breath. This is tough, she says, because both things can be true at the same time. A few audience members nod, and there's a light clap of agreement. Whoopi looks at her, then back at Brendan. Exactly, she says. That's the balance I'm talking about. Brendan pauses, then gives a small nod. I get that, he says. I just don't want the idea of balance to become a reason for hesitation. That line lands quietly, but strongly. The audience reacts with a softer, more thoughtful kind of applause. Whoopi leans back again, crossing one leg over the other now, her posture more reflective than before. And I don't want urgency to become a reason for mistakes, she replies. There's a brief silence after that. Neither of them speaks for a moment. The co-hosts look between them, clearly aware that this isn't a typical segment anymore. It's something deeper, something that's not going to be neatly wrapped up. Finally, one of the co-hosts steps in again, her tone warm but cautious. Okay, I think what we're seeing here is two perspectives that a lot of people are trying to reconcile right now. She looks at Brendan. You're talking about being heard. Then she looks at Whoopi. And you're talking about being careful. Both of them nod slightly. The audience gives a small, understanding round of applause. But even as it feels like the conversation might start to settle, Whoopi leans forward one more time. And sometimes, she says, her voice quieter now, being careful is how you make sure you don't hurt someone else in the process. Brendan meets her gaze again. And sometimes, he responds just as quietly, being too careful is how people end up staying silent. The audience reacts immediately, louder applause, a few audible wow reactions. And at that point, it's clear. This isn't just a conversation anymore. It's a moment. The applause doesn't fade as quickly this time. It lingers, louder, more emotional. Like the audience knows they just witnessed something that wasn't planned, something real. Whoopi Goldberg sits still for a second, taking it in, while Brendan Fraser leans back slightly, finally exhaling in a way that suggests even he feels the weight of what just happened. One of the co-hosts looks out toward the audience, then back at both of them, almost smiling in disbelief. "Well, this is why live television is live," she says, trying to bring a little lightness back into the room. A few people laugh, the tension easing just a notch, but not completely. Whoopi nods slowly, then looks back at Brendan. "I appreciate you being honest," she says. Her tone has shifted now, less guarded, more reflective. "Even when we don't fully agree. I think these conversations matter." Brendan gives a small nod. "They do," he says. "And I appreciate you letting it happen." That line softens the room even more. There's a quiet round of applause, less intense now, but more unified. Another co-host leans in, smiling. "I think a lot of people at home are going to be talking about this one," she says. "Because this wasn't just an interview, this was a real conversation." Whoopi lets out a small breath, almost like she's resetting the energy. "All right," she says. "Before we wrap this up, I want to make sure we don't lose sight of why you're here too." There's a light chuckle from the audience. She continues, "You've got projects, you've got work that people are excited about, and I don't want this moment to completely overshadow that." Brendan smiles slightly, more relaxed now. "I understand," he says, "and I'm really grateful for that too." The tone shifts again, lighter, but still carrying the weight of everything that just happened. They spend a brief moment talking about his work, short, respectful, almost like a cool down. The audience responds warmly, but it's clear that the earlier conversation is still sitting in everyone's mind. As the segment starts to close, Whoopi turns toward the camera. "Thank you to Brendan Fraser for being here," she says, composed again, but with a noticeable sincerity. "This was a conversation." The audience claps again, strong, appreciative. Brendan nods toward the hosts and the audience. "Thank you for having me," he says. And just like that, the cameras begin to pull back. The music starts to come in lightly. But the moment doesn't end there. Because almost immediately after the segment wraps, you can feel it. People in the audience talking to each other, reacting, some still clapping, others shaking their heads, others nodding in agreement. Backstage, according to those present, the atmosphere wasn't tense, but it wasn't casual either. It was reflective. Conversations continued off camera. Some of the co-hosts reportedly kept discussing the points even after the show cut to commercial. And then social media. Clips from The View start circulating almost instantly. Short segments of that exchange, especially the lines about silence and being heard, begin trending. Viewers start taking sides, not aggressively but passionately. Some people praise Brendan Fraser for staying calm and standing his ground. Others defend Whoopi Goldberg, saying she raised important points about responsibility and balance. And then there are those who say, this is exactly what talk shows are supposed to be. Real conversations, not just rehearsed questions and safe answers. Comments start pouring in. Finally, a real moment on daytime TV. This is what respectful disagreement looks like. You could feel the tension, but also the respect. And of course, there are debates too. Long threads breaking down every line, every pause, every reaction from the audience. Some viewers point out the moment the tone shifted. Others highlight how neither of them raised their voice, but still managed to create one of the most intense segments in recent memory. By the end of the day, the clip has been shared across platforms, picked up by discussion pages, reaction channels, and media outlets analyzing what was said and what it meant. And behind the scenes, there's talk that this segment may have sparked internal conversations too, about how far daytime TV can go when it leans into real, unscripted dialogue. But for the audience watching at home, it wasn't about behind-the-scenes details. It was about what they felt in that moment. Because what started as a standard interview turned into something else entirely. Something honest, something uncomfortable, something real. And those are the moments people remember. As everything settles, one thing is clear. This wasn't just another appearance. It was a conversation that people are still talking about. Now it's your turn. What did you think about this exchange between Brendan Fraser and Whoopi Goldberg? Do you agree with Brendan's perspective? Or do you think Whoopi made the stronger point? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.